Hey there, Nick Hackers here. In this video, we're going to go over how to send a multi-line string heredoc to curl in a shell script. This could be really useful if you are sending a JSON payload to a server and you want to keep that JSON to be human readable so it's maintainable for you in the future. So before we get too deep into the woods and some use cases here, let's just start running some commands, looking at code and seeing how things work. And by the way, for the sake of this video, I am using a tool called web server. It's a standalone web server that you can run, zero dependencies. We're basically going to use this as an echo server so that we can run some curl commands and see what happened. So I've done videos about that one in the past. I'll leave a card up to that one, but this little script that I'm running here, this web server one, is that. So let me go ahead and just make a script here. We'll call it demo. By the way, I've also done videos about this little make script. You may want to check that one out. It's just a very quick way to create a new shell script here, make it executable, and fill it out with things like this. So now I can actually run this demo script here, and we should see something there. Cool. Hello world. It is all working. So yeah, let's just copy in a curl command here that I have, and we'll just take a look at running this one here. So I will rerun the script here, the demo script, and we can see that it returns back status okay here as JSON, and our echo server says, yep, this is what we got back. You know, here's the headers that were set, as well as what we're getting back here as a response. And in this case, the response is literally just the request that we send in. But yeah, let's deconstruct this curl command really quick here in case you've never worked too much with curl before. So we have the URL that we want to send the request to. We want to say that it's a post request. Technically, I think if you have the data attribute set, you don't need to set this because it will use post by default. But I like to be explicit in this case. We also say that we want this content type to be application JSON. So we send that over as a header. And then we are saying the data that we are passing in, it is JSON over here. So we make that request, and this is what we get here in the end. And this looks pretty standard, no problem, right? Pretty typical JSON. You know, if you threw this into, I don't know, some type of like JSON formatter or validator, this would be valid JSON that you see here. But this gets kind of interesting, right? I notice that we are using single quotes here because with JSON, you know, all the attributes here need to be quoted with double quotes. Well, for strings, for example, you know, if it's an integer, it doesn't need to be wrapped in quotes. But this is kind of interesting. Like, let's just say that, you know, this is in a shell script that you're writing. And, you know, maybe the status isn't a hard-coded string, but instead it's a variable. So, you know, you could think like, okay, cool. Well, I'll just reference this as a variable like this, and we're good to go, right? And we can just run our script again. And not quite, right? Because we actually see here that we literally get $ squiggly status here as the output. Why? Because this whole entire string is wrapped in single quotes. And when you are working with shell scripts and you wrap something in single quotes, then it is literally going to output these characters here. You're not going to get variable interpolation. So that's one gotcha of, you know, why you might not want to just wrap a string, you know, like this. So you might think like, well, that's fine then, you know, can't we just use double quotes? Totally could. Problem there is JSON, you know, there's a lot of double quoting going on there. So you'll have to find yourself, you know, escaping this double quote here, escaping this double quote, escaping this double quote. And then if you were to run this one, this should work, I think. Yep, there we go. So everything is good to go. We get our valid JSON back here and life is good. But this is already starting to get a little bit hard to read as a human being, right? We have to escape all these things and geez, we're just dealing with like one property here. You know, what happens when things start to get a little bit more complex? So I've got another curl command here that's going to paste in just so, you know, you don't need to watch me fail typing manual JSON here. Let me also make this a little bit easier to read for now. You know, we'll bring this back in a second here, or I guess I can technically just make this a little bit bigger on this side. Done. Okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, this is now starting to get to be slightly more complicated. You know, instead of just having a single property like we had before, we now have an array and we have, you know, a list of objects here. And each one of these objects has a couple of different properties, right? We have an ID with a number and we have status and pending here. So, you know, I can just run this like this and things are pretty normal, right? This is all working as expected. You know, again, we have to use the single quotes here because, yeah, who wants to escape all these double quotes? Not this guy. And I don't know, like even this is starting to get pretty difficult to read. Like, you know, let's say that you're interfacing with some API and you need to send a JSON payload over. You know, this is only 2 objects here with a couple of properties. You know, what if there were like, you know, 4 objects here and a couple of them are nested? Like trying to deal with this on one line, that is not maintainable in the future. It's not fun. You know, it's error prone. It's just not nice. So, and by the way, this all came out of a real world use case that I was doing something for some client work where, you know, I like writing shell scripts a lot. You know, I don't overly use them, but in this case, it made sense for some glue code to basically contact Jira's API and Bitbucket's API and, you know, make some tickets, make some pull requests and associate those things together. And there are properties of curl that I've used in the past. Like, for example, Instead of just passing a string to data, you can actually pass the @ symbol and then a file to data. And this is actually quite nice where, for example, and this is not going to work because I don't have the file created, and we'll get to the examples in a second here. But, you can actually just do like, example.json or something like that. And if you had an example.json file in this directory and ran this command as it is, then this would actually use that file as the input here for data. Curl's going to be responsible for just taking in all that text there and just doing whatever it needs to do to turn it into data here for the flag, and everything is good. And then your file could be formatted however you want, multiple lines, etc. And that's actually not that bad. And I knew about this behavior for a really long time, and that's kind of what I've done quite a lot in scripts. So I started to think, I'm like, well, okay, I want my JSON to be pretty readable because I was using Jira's API, and I had to send in, I don't know, like 7 or 8 objects and a list, and it was a pretty okay amount of JSON, right? Let's call it like 15 or 20 lines. And for sure, it couldn't just be a one-liner. And what I thought was like, okay, well, I don't know, it's a little janky to try to create a heredoc with shell scripts and assign it to a variable. Actually, I think, do I have this preloaded? I do. So, that's one thing that I always find myself Googling for a lot. Literally this, how do I assign a heredoc value to a variable in Bash? And, you can start doing things like this where you can use read with a couple of different flags and then use the heredoc here. And now, it's going to be in a variable that then you can use, however you see fit here. In this case, we're echoing it there. But I've noticed that, I don't know, there's also all sorts of caveats around with that. So you can see there's a lot of comments here where if you're using something like the error option, set E, or what we have here set in our script here, which is the same thing, like the option for error exit, then apparently read is going to return a non-zero return code when it reaches end of file. So, this is going to make your script essentially fail, even though if it works. And I don't want to have to do with that. Technically you could wrap this in plus E, and then after the read command, go back to using set dash E, turning it on and off basically. That would work, but I don't want to really have to deal with that. And then there's other issues here as well. I know different versions of Bash. I know certain flags have acted differently. For example, on macOS, if you don't explicitly brew install Bash, you end up with having Bash 3.2 installed, and there's different license, situations on why that's not updated. But in anyways, I don't know if the R&D flags are different in Bash 3.2 versus a newer version of Bash, 4 or 5. But there is definitely a read flag that I noticed that doesn't work the same as Bash 4 on macOS. And yeah, this is related to versions of Bash. Again, it may not apply to this specific command with these sets of flags, but it's not something I want to even have to think about. And then there's I don't know, there was something else over here too. For example, when it comes to using quotes here, you're just going to get slightly different behavior here if you quote this variable or not. Yeah, I don't know. These are a lot of things where it's man, I just want to have a multi-line string that's readable. So I try to avoid the idea of just putting a variable and doing something similar to what we saw in Stack Overflow. So you can get around this sort of easily, and I'm about to paste something in here. And this is the initial approach that I took here. And it is not the worst thing in the world, but there's kind of a lot going on here. Basically the takeaway of this one is, we're still using that data in the file. But the idea here is we just create a temp file and then we populate that file with some text here. This is more, complicated example here, or actually it's the previous example that we just saw, but it's a little bit more, fleshed out to be multi-lines, a little bit more human readable. This was the original over here where it was kind of all in one line. And you can make a case this one-liner is actually not too bad. For example, I would make a case maybe that's a little bit easier to read where each object is on its own line, but we're only dealing with 2 properties here, right? If you had 10 properties or 5 or whatever, it becomes a lot harder, especially with nesting and stuff. Whatever, this is in your full control. You can format this however you want based on the complexity of your JSON object. But this is pretty standard pattern here where you can send this heredoc here, a multi-line string of whatever you want. You can basically feed that into cat as input and then redirect that out to a file. So this is pretty standard. I don't know, I use this pattern a lot when I actually want to write a file out. But in this case, we make the temp file, cool, it's there, and then we make our curl request with the temp file, and then we delete the temp file at the end. So if I run this, then we should get what we expect here. There is the request that we sent in, and it works. And this works, but I don't know, there's a lot going on here, right? We have to create files and we have to clean up files, and you kind of have to know what this kind of does beforehand. It's a little bit not super complicated, but unless you've never seen this pattern before, you may look at this and it's it's even hard to Google for if you don't know the definitions of how things are working here, right? There's that. And also, I don't know, there's also implications with this remove command here. For example, you probably know this, but if you try to, let me zoom into one of these things just so we can mess around with something. If I try to remove a file called hello in this directory, which doesn't exist, we can see here that we got an exit code of, what happened there? No, I'm breaking things. Hold on. What did I do? RM, hello. Well, let's not mess with that. Yeah. So we could see here, though, we did get an exit code of 1 or a non-zero exit code here. Like this file just doesn't exist here. But did you know that if you actually do -f here on the file, then this will actually not fail. This command will always work whether or not the file exists or not. So depending on what you want to do in your script over here, then actually, why the heck didn't this work exactly? Yeah, that works fine. I guess it was because I was zoomed in with Tmux. It did something strange. That's kind of weird. But anyways, let's go back to what we just did before. Well, hold on. I don't think you can see this anymore. But yeah, if I try to remove this file now, we can see that we will get an exit code of 1 there, right? And then going back to just before, rm-f hello, then we see the status code of 0. In other words, it works. Cool. Okay. Anyways, going back to that, this is more context you need to be aware of in the script, right? Maybe you do want the script to fail if the file doesn't exist. And, these are just things you need to keep in your head. But at the end of the day, it's like, you don't really care about files and this and this and that. Like you're just trying to send a multi-line string to curl to make your life easier, right? So then I started Googling around a little bit and it makes a lot of sense now. So here's another solution that I ended up arriving at here. And when I say I arrived, Google research found it, and I'm actually using this in the script, and it's totally working. So let's go and run this demo script over here. Same thing as before, it's all working as you would expect. And the difference here, though, is look, there's no temp files being created. There's no variables that have to hold the contents of this, and then we just send it in to data as a string or whatever like that. Nope, we are just using general patterns and conventions that exist in many command line tools, at least on Unix and Linux, Mac OS, etc., etc. And that convention is being able to use the dash as kind of like a fill-in for either standard in or standard out, depending on the context that you're working in. So this isn't something built into bash or shell or the Linux kernel or, all commands in general. Commands need to support this convention, but you'll find oftentimes, I'm not going to say basically every tool will support this one, but, the serious tools like curl and, a lot of the GNU tools that are available, they will support this pattern. It's very dependable. I actually can't really think of too many tools that I use in my day-to-day that I tried to do this and it didn't work. But in any case here, we're just using the data flag just like we did before with the @ symbol. And instead of literally passing in a file name, we're passing in dash. But, using that convention, you can say, well, dash is really standard in at this point. So we are basically just sending in our multi-line string to curl as standard in. This is now working due to conventions here, and things work in the end. And that is pretty cool. And that's it. So you'll notice too, for example, and this is one interesting thing of just having the echo server running, you can see that the response, if you were to actually curl an endpoint, the endpoint is going to receive your JSON formatted like this. And when you use a data flag like this with curl, it is going to replace new lines with nothingness. So it's basically stripping all the new lines. And I learned today, actually, that if you use data binary, then you can rerun the same commands here, and your new lines are going to stay intact. Now, both of them are technically valid JSON. So, if you took this here and just dropped that into a JSON validator, this is valid JSON and this is as well. Typically the server that you're sending JSON to probably doesn't need it to have the new lines. But if you are dealing with a system where, maybe you do want to keep those new lines intact, then you can just use data-binary and that is going to work. That is actually in curl's documentation there. If you ever were to look up the D flag for data here, you'll see that's called out there. And there's other ones too, like data raw, etc. I haven't really played with those too much. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for this video. I'm really happy now. This is a pretty decent pattern if you're just writing some glue scripts where you just want to send something like a multi-line string into curl. Here you go. There's basically not a one-liner, but kind of is I'm breaking up the lines to make it easier to read. But yeah, there we go. Let me know in the comments below what patterns you use to do this. Is this something that you're actually using? Is there a different way to do this one, etc., etc. With that said, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next video.